Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez locked eyes with the President of the United States and delivered her opening strike, her voice echoing with the practiced cadence of a seasoned political fighter. She told him, point blank in front of an audience of 11 million live viewers, that while they had both grown up in the sprawling borough of Queens, there was one glaring, inescapable discrepancy. She had actually lived in its beating heart, breathing its air and riding its trains, while he had remained safely insulated behind his wealthy father's gilded wrought iron fences. She delivered this indictment with the razor-sharp, calculated smile she instinctively deploys when she knows a soundbite has been perfectly engineered to go nuclear across every social media platform, and the physical gallery inside the convention center absolutely exploded in response. The raw kinetic energy in the room was palpable. You could almost feel the kinetic force of 80,000 retweets firing off in real time before she even had the chance to take her seat at the debate table. Tonight was supposed to be her coronation, the definitive moment she dismantled the Republican titan on their shared home turf. But in that fleeting instance of triumph, she realized she had miscalculated by mocking the absolute wrong target. Donald Trump did not offer a polite, rehearsed political chuckle or a defensive grimace. Instead, he laughed, a genuine, unforced, head thrown back, shoulders heaving, eyes crinkling eruption of amusement that telegraphed a devastating reality to everyone watching. Zero damage had been taken, and the incoming fire had not only been absorbed, but found entirely entertaining. He leaned into his microphone, the undeniable master of his domain, and effortlessly recalibrated the entire dynamic of the evening. Two kids from Queens, she's right, he acknowledged. His tone conversational but dripping with lethal precision, but only one of the two knows the crime rate in Queens right now, and it's not her. In the span of a single breathlessly delivered sentence, 11 million viewers instantly understood the catastrophic trap she had just walked into. She had voluntarily invited the man who knew the subterranean mechanics of Queens better than she did into a street fight about their hometown, and he had come armed with the one thing she lacked: hard, unforgiving numbers. The atmosphere inside the Flushing Convention Center shifted violently, the air thick with the smell of newly laid industrial carpet, the oppressive heat of dozens of television camera rigs, and the cloying chemical sweetness of too many floral arrangements desperately trying to make a cavernous exhibition hall feel like an intimate living room. It did not work because the room felt exactly like what it was: a high-stakes, hyper-illuminated stage set erected in the middle of Queens for two global figures who had spent the better part of the last 7 years convincing the American electorate that they hailed from entirely different planets. Ocasio-Cortez had arrived first, projecting an image of relentless momentum in a sharp navy blazer and a crisp white blouse, her statement earrings catching and refracting the harsh stage lights every time she moved her head. And she moved her head constantly, because AOC does not sit still, has never sat still, and has spent her entire meteoric public life in a state of perpetual, aggressive motion. She took her position at the table exactly the way veteran bartenders sit during a break, leaning intensely forward, elbows planted firmly nearly on the surface of the desk, coils wound tight and ready to spring up at any given millisecond. 7 grueling years navigating the labyrinthine corridors of Congress had not managed to train the Bronx bartender out of her posture, primarily because that very posture was the bedrock of her political brand, a physical manifestation of her working-class combativeness. Trump, operating on an entirely different theatrical wavelength, bypassed the main entrance that the rest of the world had used and entered from behind the heavy stage curtains, honoring his lifelong refusal to walk through doors that other people had already opened. He stepped into the light and methodically surveyed the audience, scanning the rows of faces and cameras with the possessive, calculating gaze of a billionaire landlord assessing a pre-war building he was strongly considering acquiring. This was his territory, his Queens. He had grown up a mere 12 miles from this exact room, and his father, Fred Trump, had constructed massive, sprawling apartment complexes within walking distance of the very stage he now commanded. For him, the geography of this debate was profoundly personal, imbued with a territorial gravity that no sterile, wood-paneled congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. could ever hope to replicate. Her opening 4 minutes were a masterclass in progressive storytelling, painting a vivid, hyper-specific portrait of the borough that bypassed political talking points and went straight for the visceral reality of working-class survival. She didn't talk about the queens of zoning boards and tax brackets. She conjured the real queens, The jarring screech of the Q44 bus rattling down the avenue at 6 in the morning, the harsh fluorescent glare of the corner bodega that cashed weekly paychecks because the commercial banks were too far and too predatory, and the rhythmic metallic thunder of the elevated train shaking a bedroom window that could never quite close all the way. She painted this landscape with the intense, undeniable authority of a woman who had spent years serving cocktails and wiping down bars in this exact borough long before she ever took an oath to serve in the United States Congress. When she executed her pivot to Trump, tilting her chin up with that defiant, trademark smirk, her delivery was flawless. We're both from Queens, but the difference, and this is a massive difference, Mr. President, is that I actually lived there while you lived in Jamaica Estates. The part with the security gate, the private drive, and the chauffeur who drove you right past the rest of us without ever tapping the brakes. She commanded him not to lecture her about where she grew up, accusing him of only knowing the borough as a distant view from behind his daddy's iron fence, and the room detonated with the raw, full-throated, unmanaged eruption of a hometown audience that had just witnessed a local girl publicly verbally execute a billionaire using the exact vernacular the working class used to mock Jamaica Estates. In the designated AOC section of the gallery, a vibrant mosaic of young voters, women in hijabs, and organizers wearing union t-shirts leapt to their feet, hoisting a hand-painted sign screaming, "Bronx Girl Energy." While in the tightly packed press pen, a veteran Telemundo camera operator leaned over and whispered intensely to his sound man, "She killed him." But she hadn't killed him. She hadn't even grazed him. Trump was already laughing, that booming, impenetrable laugh, the kind of laugh that signals total psychological ownership of a room, a brazen refusal to accept damage, signaling to the millions watching at home that the incoming artillery had been cleanly caught, analyzed, and dismissed as lightweight entertainment. "Two kids from Queens, I love it, and she's right," he fired back, his voice cutting through the fading applause like a serrated blade. "I grew up behind a fence. My father had a fence, but my father also had buildings. Fred Trump built thousands of apartments for working families right here in Queens, in Coney Island, Brighton Beach, Jamaica, Flatbush, giving the very people you're talking about a decent place to live." He leaned in closer, weaponizing a predatory grin as he delivered the kill shot. "I left Queens and built buildings too, hotels, towers, casinos, and when I left, Queens was doing just fine. The Congresswoman left Queens too, but she didn't build buildings. She built an Instagram account, and when she left to become your representative, violent crime in her district skyrocketed by 70%, so Queens knows the difference between a kid who builds and a kid who posts." The laughter in the auditorium abruptly mutated, snapping from raucous progressive triumph to a deeply uncomfortable, uncertain murmur as the AOC supporters realized their thunderous applause had just been masterfully hijacked and retrofitted into the setup for Trump's devastating punchline. In the neutral seating section, a woman wearing a faded, grease-stained uniform from the Bear Diner on Queens Boulevard slowly uncrossed her arms, her posture shifting from casual observation to intense, critical scrutiny as she watched the political theater unfold. Trump, sensing the blood in the water, executed his signature physical maneuver, producing a crisp, printed page from his jacket and waving it toward the bank of network cameras, a gesture residing somewhere between a seasoned trial lawyer presenting a damning forensic exhibit and a proud fisherman showing off his morning catch. He rattled off the statistics with brutal efficiency, noting that crime in her specific jurisdiction, the 14th Congressional District of New York, was up a staggering 70% since she took her oath of office, explicitly citing the FBI Uniform Crime Report to preemptively neutralize any accusations of partisan fabrication. "Not my numbers, the FBI's numbers, and you can check it tonight," he challenged, staring directly across the table at Ocasio-Cortez. "I encourage her to check it tonight because I seriously doubt she has ever checked it before." He paused, letting the silence expand before deploying the trap. "Congresswoman, what is the crime rate in your district right now?" Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again, a physical manifestation of a catastrophic system failure. She wasn't pausing to formulate a nuanced policy answer. She was frantically searching the empty archives of her memory for a statistic that simply was not there. 11 million people watched this agonizing mental search fail in real time, watching her grasp at the air the way a panicked commuter aggressively pats down their coat pockets, looking for a set of keys they already know they have permanently lost. In the gallery, a woman wearing a heavy J&M laundry smock leaned forward, fixing the Congresswoman with the exact expression of cold, judgmental dread that a desperate customer gives to an expensive mechanic who just admitted they have no idea what is wrong with the engine. It was a profound, radiating doubt. The chilling realization that the person entrusted with your survival does not actually possess the fundamental knowledge they are being heavily compensated to wield. Trump seamlessly filled the agonizing vacuum, mocking her inability to answer by suggesting she had been far too busy with private jets, high society Instagram updates, and disastrous international summits in Munich to bother learning the basic survival metrics of the constituents she claimed to fiercely champion. At the mere mention of the word Munich, Ocasio-Cortez's right hand unconsciously slid to the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the table with the bracing intensity of a roller coaster passenger who suddenly realizes the car has crested the peak and the impending drop is completely invisible. Trump, abandoning the role of the grinning entertainer, transformed into a lethal inquisitor as he brought up her heavily scrutinized appearance at the Munich Security Conference the previous February, highlighting the moment she was asked a binary, elementary foreign policy question about whether the United States should commit military forces to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Every serious foreign policy official in the world has a prepared answer for this, Trump stated, his voice dropping into a register of mocking solemnity. And here is exactly what the Congresswoman, the woman who wants to be commander-in-chief, said word for word, completely unedited. He began reading from the transcript, deliberately matching her halting, uncertain cadence, which was infinitely more devastating than an exaggerated impression. Cruel mockery can easily be dismissed by the press as partisan bullying, but cold verbatim accuracy can only be countered by being blatantly inaccurate, and these were her undeniable televised words. He read the agonizingly fragmented response, verbally underlining every single hesitant filler word. I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course a very long-standing policy of the United States. He lowered the paper, staring directly into the camera lens. 7 ums in 40 seconds. I counted them. And the absolute best part is that after this catastrophic performance on the global stage, with China watching, with Taiwan watching, she logged on to Instagram and literally called herself just a silly girl. He weaponized the phrase, letting it hang in the stifling air of the convention center. Ocasio-Cortez immediately interjected, her voice tight and defensive, insisting that the comment was clearly intended as heavy sarcasm regarding her own perceived competence in front of world leaders. Trump did not miss a beat, firing back with lethal timing. Well, you were sarcastic about your own competence, and I think you succeeded brilliantly because every world leader in that room believed you. The word believed left his mouth and struck the center of the room like a heavy stone dropped into a completely still body of water. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't rushed, but the invisible ripples of its impact washed over the press section where the frantic typing abruptly ceased and rolled through the progressive seating block where a young activist wearing a tax the rich sweatshirt slowly lowered his gaze to his glowing phone screen and deliberately refused to look back up. Someone in the heavily shadowed third row drew in a sharp, audible breath, the involuntary, instinctual gasp that occurs when the human body physically registers a devastating blow long before the conscious brain has fully processed the trauma. Ocasio-Cortez's chin, which had been held at a defiant, perfectly level angle since her opening monologue, the tough bartender chin, the rebellious rally chin, the chin that wordlessly screamed, "I belong in this arena," imperceptibly dropped half an inch. It was the exact microscopic distance a human chin travels when the person behind it hears a devastating truth they cannot instantly refute, their biology betraying their absolute lack of an answer before their vocal cords can even attempt to mount a defense. Sensing total command of the narrative, Trump shifted gears once more, dialing back the theatrical comedian and replacing him with the ruthless 50-year veteran of corporate boardrooms who had spent half a century dissecting bloated expense reports and hunting for the one anomalous line item that could destroy a rival. Let's talk about how the Congresswoman spends her money, because she loves to lecture us about the struggles of working people, and I want to see if her ledger matches her rhetoric. He began, his voice tightening with prosecutorial focus. He mapped out her hypocrisy with surgical precision, highlighting a February tweet where she proudly boasted about commuting to Washington via public rail or standard commercial flights to maintain her woman of the people image, only to deliberately juxtapose it with her actions on Earth Day just 2 months later. April 2025, Earth Day of all days, she steps off a Bombardier Challenger private jet in Bakersfield, California. burning through $15,000 an hour on a tour she literally called Fight Oligarchy. The irony was so concentrated it practically choked the room as Trump leaned into the microphone. Fighting oligarchy from a private jet. I've flown private my entire adult life, but I don't call it fighting oligarchy. I call it a typical Tuesday, and at least I have the basic decency to be honest about it. The gallery erupted into deeply conflicted laughter, starting in the unaligned center and radiating outward, the kind of complex, undeniable laughter that inevitably spreads when the punchline is constructed entirely from damning evidence, blurring the lines between stand-up comedy and a federal indictment. But Trump wasn't finished. He pivoted smoothly to her campaign's exorbitant lodging expenses, pulling up a $53,000 expenditure at the ultra-luxurious Vdara Hotel in Las Vegas. $3,500 a night, he marveled, his tone dripping with condescension. I know Vdara intimately. I own the massive golden building right next door, and let me tell you, $3,000 a night is not fighting the oligarchy. That is the definition of oligarchy. You know who stays at Vdara? Actual oligarchs, and apparently the progressive congresswoman who claims to be fighting them. He paused, leaning heavily on the table to deliver the fatal strike regarding her internal staff communications. But this is the part that truly kills me. Her staff emailed each other insisting on nothing below a 4-star rating because she is particular about thread count. Thread count. I've been building luxury hotels for 4 decades. I know exactly what a high thread count implies. A person who obsesses over thread count is not a revolutionary bartender fighting for the proletariat. That person is a pampered customer. He immediately contrasted this with the gritty reality of Gloria Reyes, a 60-year-old immigrant who had owned a struggling bakery in Corona, Queens, right in the heart of AOC's district for 19 grueling years. Gloria wakes up at 4 in the morning every single day in the freezing cold to knead dough. She sleeps on cheap sheets she hauls across the street to wash at a public laundromat. Gloria couldn't care less about thread count. Gloria is particular about making her commercial rent before the bank seizes her livelihood. In the gallery, the woman in the faded diner uniform nodded. Not a massive theatrical gesture, but a small, heavy, undeniable affirmation. It was the solemn nod of a woman who intimately understood the unforgiving sound of an alarm clock at 4 in the morning, a silent verdict from the working class confirming that a politician obsessed with luxury betting had lost all connection to their struggle. The political entertainer vanished entirely, leaving only the cold, calculating executive armed with the one thing capable of destroying a political career permanently: actionable financial irregularities. The temperature in the convention center plummeted, not in a metaphorical sense, but as a genuine, palpable shift in the atmospheric pressure. The room changed the exact way a courtroom shifts when the prosecutor stops playing to the jury box and begins reading directly from the unsealed federal indictment. Trump unspooled the labyrinthine mechanics of a $900,000 transfer from her campaign coffers to a shadowy entity known as Brand New Congress LLC, operated by her former chief of staff. He meticulously noted that while every single Federal Election Commission filing deliberately classified the massive payouts as strategic consulting, her own staffer had arrogantly admitted on live television to MSNBC that the company entirely controlled their fundraising and ground operations. That is not consulting. That is illegal campaign operation obfuscation, and listing it as such on a federal document is a blatant federal violation, Trump declared, his voice cutting like glass. He cited a former FEC commissioner, explicitly noting the official was not a partisan Republican, who had publicly stated there was unequivocally enough damning evidence to warrant a sprawling civil investigation and potentially a criminal probe by the Department of Justice. He didn't stop to let her breathe, immediately pivoting to a March 2026 irregularity. 3 distinct payments totaling over $18,000 funneled to a Dr. Brian Bowl in Massachusetts, fraudulently categorized on official transparency forms as leadership training. Dr. Bowl is a licensed psychiatrist, Trump revealed, staring into the camera. He doesn't do leadership seminars, he conducts psychiatric therapy. $18,000 in hard-earned donor money from people exactly like Gloria the baker, who sends whatever scraps she can afford, secretly paid to a therapist and laundered as leadership training. That is a massive violation. He brought the narrative devastatingly back to the bakery owner in Corona, painting a tragic picture of Gloria sacrificing $20 a month from her razor-thin profit margins because she genuinely believed her progressive hero was fighting the establishment, completely unaware her desperate contributions were subsidizing luxury travel and private psychiatric sessions. Gloria didn't know, Trump whispered into the microphone, his eyes locked on his opponent. But Gloria knows now. Ocasio-Cortez refused to meet his gaze, desperately looking to her high-priced defense attorney seated in the front row, but the lawyer was aggressively writing on a yellow legal pad, intentionally avoiding any eye contact with his increasingly panicked client. The agonizing distance between her pleading eyes and her lawyer's heavily bowed head was the exact, tragic measurement between a politician desperately praying for a lifeline and a seasoned legal operative who thoroughly understood that attempting a rescue on national television was not a service he could ever successfully bill for. Then came the ultimate flex of executive authority, the sheer asymmetric power dynamic that only a sitting president could wield on a debate stage. Trump casually leaked that the Federal Election Commission was actively reviewing the previously deadlocked 2019 complaint alongside the fresh psychiatric fund laundering allegations. Two open complaints. He smirked, the devastating reality sinking into the room. I've only ever faced one impeachment at a time. She's officially beating me. The initial ripple of nervous laughter collapsed into a suffocating, terrified silence, crashing against the walls like a tidal wave hitting a concrete seawall because the audience suddenly realized the joke was actually a terrifying federal announcement. In the press gallery, a chaotic symphony of frantically clicking keyboards ceased as every single investigative journalist dropped their laptops and began aggressively texting their editors, producers, and assignment desks. The President of the United States had just unilaterally confirmed active, high-level federal investigations into a sitting superstar congresswoman on live primetime television, transforming a standard debate clip into an apocalyptic news cycle designed to consume all other news cycles. Ocasio-Cortez's physical demeanor had drastically altered, the transformation entirely internal and visible only in the microscopic details that high-definition lenses capture and human audiences intuitively feel. Her left hand, which had been casually and confidently folded resting on the tabletop during her aggressive opening remarks, was now pressed completely flat against the wood grain, a desperate anchoring gesture of a person trying to physically stabilize themselves on a ship that is rapidly taking on water. Her attorney subtly reached out and touched her arm. Earlier in the night, she had aggressively brushed away his counsel twice, projecting the fierce independence of a street fighter who didn't need a handler. But now, the defiance was gone. She let the hand remain on her sleeve, a silent, devastating admission that the fighter was finally accepting outside help, because the fighter fully realized she was actively bleeding out on the canvas. But she rallied, tapping into the absolute last reserves of her Bronx combat instincts, refusing to sit silently in her own borough while a golden elevator billionaire lectured her about the very street she claimed to own. She sprang to her feet, her voice trembling with manufactured righteous indignation. You want to talk about Queens? Let's talk about a borough where the minimum wage still doesn't cover a studio apartment, where families bleed themselves dry working 3 simultaneous jobs and still can't afford basic childcare, where the municipal hospitals are closing their doors, the public schools are crumbling to dust, and the archaic subway tunnels flood every single time it rains. She pointed a trembling finger directly at his chest. That is the real Queens, not your insulated Jamaica estates with the manicured lawn service and the high-priced property tax attorneys. The Queens I came from, the Queens I bleed for, the Queens I serve. Don't you dare! Trump cut her off before she could reach the crescendo, not with shouting, not with anger, but with 2 flat, emotionless words that sliced through her soaring political rhetoric like a diamond wire cutting through a thick cloud of smoke. Crime rate. He didn't smile. He didn't lean in. He simply weaponized the exact vulnerability she had just spent 3 breathless minutes attempting to camouflage. You just said, the Queens I serve. So, tell us, what is the crime rate in the Queens you serve? It was the exact same question, deployed for the second time precisely 40 minutes after the initial trap, and the second deployment was categorically, structurally, and irreversibly more devastating than the first. The first agonizing silence could have generously been attributed to the chaotic surprise of live television. The second silence offered no such refuge. She had been granted 40 minutes. Her sprawling, highly paid communications team had been granted 40 minutes. An entire war room equipped with secure Wi-Fi, high-speed smartphones, and unrestricted access to every single statistical database maintained by the federal government had been given 40 minutes to locate a single fundamental numerical figure about one specific district represented by one uniquely famous congresswoman who was currently standing on national television being publicly interrogated by a man she had just accused of profound geographic ignorance. She did not say the number. She did not say it because her team had failed to find it, or far worse, because she knew the number and realized that confessing violent crime was up 70% under her watch would be politically deadlier than the silence itself. The mechanical result was identical. The single most famous, heavily followed, culturally dominant progressive politician in the United States of America was standing center stage in her own backyard, paralyzed in front of 11 million voters, utterly incapable of answering a fundamental baseline question about the survival of her own people. The fire behind her eyes, the kinetic spark that had confidently mocked him and labeled him a sheltered boy behind a golden fence just an hour prior, had completely extinguished. Her eyes were wide open, the stage lights reflected in her pupils, but there was absolutely nobody home projecting the exact haunting aura of a television set that is still powered on but has entirely lost its broadcast signal. Trump did something in that devastating vacuum that absolutely no seasoned political analyst could have ever predicted. He completely dropped the theatrical showmanship. He discarded the trademark smirk, the rapid-fire one-liners, the bombastic document waving, and the razor-sharp comedic timing that had defined his entire public existence. What emerged to fill the silence was a vocal register that 11 million Americans had never once heard emanate from Donald Trump. It was not exactly soft, but it was uncharacteristically plain, stripped of all gold-plated armor. It was the grounded, unfiltered voice of an older man from Queens talking directly to a younger woman from Queens about the bleeding soul of Queens. "I want to say something to the Congresswoman," he murmured, his tone devoid of malice, not as the President of the United States, but just as a kid from Queens. The sprawling convention center plunged into a state of absolute breathless stillness, the specific, reverent silence of an arena that instinctively recognizes a profound shift in register, mimicking the hush that falls over a chaotic stadium when the rock star finally sets aside the screaming electric guitar and slowly pulls an acoustic instrument onto their lap. "You are incredibly talented. I've always said that. Everyone says that," Trump continued, speaking directly to her humanity rather than her politics. "You have a rare ability to fill a massive room, to make people cry, to make them open their wallets, to make them genuinely believe that the system can change. That is a massive gift. Not many people possess it. I have a different version of it, but I have it, and you certainly have it. But what on earth are you actually using it for?" He didn't wait for an answer, systematically dismantling her progressive mythology with quiet, lethal disappointment. Instagram, TikTok, the Met Gala, flying to Munich to embarrass yourself in front of foreign adversaries because you couldn't answer a basic military question and then hiding behind the excuse of being a silly girl, private luxury jets and obsessing over four-star hotel thread counts? He shook his head, the disappointment radiating outward. "You have been handed absolutely everything, the voice, the global platform, the nearly 10 million loyal followers. And what have you actually done with it for the people of Queens? Zero major laws passed. 70% more violent crime in your streets. You chased away 25,000 high-paying Amazon jobs, leaving your own constituents struggling to pay a rent they can no longer afford, while you sleep comfortably in luxury hotels they could never even dream of walking into. You were right about the fence. My father lived behind a fence, but he built thousands of real, tangible apartments for working-class families right here in this borough. Real buildings, real heavy doors, real brass keys. People lived their lives in them. People raised their children in them. My father, from behind his insulated fence, built vastly more for the working class of Queens than you have ever built posing in front of every television camera in America." He allowed the crushing weight of the comparison to settle over the room before speaking again, his voice dropping into an intimately quiet, almost entirely private register, the sound of a man delivering a hard, undeniable truth. "Go home, Congresswoman. I'm not saying send her back, and I am telling you to go home. Queens desperately needs you, but you have to actually go back to them, not for a meticulously curated photo op, not for a heavily guarded campaign rally. Go home, learn the damn crime rate, learn what the rent actually costs, learn Gloria Reyes's name, and learn what 4 in the morning actually looks like from inside a freezing bakery in Corona. Because right now, in this exact moment, you do not know, and Queens knows you don't know, and I promise you that is infinitely worse than anything I could ever possibly say about you." The massive audience did not break into applause. Instead, they engaged in a collective, involuntary physical reaction that has no formal political terminology. They simply exhaled. It was the synchronized release of thousands of people who had just witnessed a profound, unvarnished truth articulated by the most unlikely messenger imaginable, a localized geographic truth about a suffering borough, realizing with the slow, terrifying clarity of a Polaroid photograph developing in a darkroom that their glamorous, globe-trotting representative had become a total stranger to the very street she claimed to champion. In the heavily shadowed fourth row, a 60-year-old woman wearing a faded hairnet and orthopedic shoes, bearing the unmistakable bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been standing on her feet since long before sunrise, reached up and quietly wiped her eyes. She wasn't crying out of sympathy for Ocasio-Cortez, nor was she shedding tears of admiration for Trump. She was weeping for queens. She was mourning the forgotten functional queens she remembered, the queens that had stable blue-collar jobs, the queens that had local representatives who intimately knew the cracks in the pavement, a queens that was currently being reduced to horrifying crime statistics that neither polished politician on that brightly lit stage could mask. Her silent tears belonged exclusively to the rattling Q44 bus, the fluorescent hum of the 24-hour laundromat, the freezing 4:00 a.m. bakery, and every single cracked concrete block that both of these famous kids from Queens had walked upon before one decided to build physical skyscrapers and the other decided to build an inescapable digital empire, leaving the real bleeding borough trapped squarely in the middle, desperately waiting for salvation. When the debate moderator finally broke the heavy silence to ask if the Congresswoman wished to deliver her official closing statement, she mechanically stood and delivered a perfectly modulated speech about the Bronx, her hardworking mother, the resilient working families of New York, and the eternal righteous fight for systemic justice. The vocabulary was flawless, the emotional delivery was precisely engineered, and the tone was the exact, soaring, inspirational pitch that had catapulted her into the stratosphere of American political history. But tonight, the spell was irrevocably broken. Her soaring rhetoric was echoing into a vast cavern of a room that had already mentally and emotionally vacated the premises, mirroring the hollow feeling of an audience politely enduring the final minutes of a concert encore when they had already witnessed the climax and knew everything following it was meaningless postscript. She pointedly did not mention the surging crime rate. She completely avoided the Munich catastrophe. She glossed over the active FEC criminal complaints, and she absolutely refused to utter a single syllable regarding luxury thread counts, private bombardier jets, or the Massachusetts psychiatrist fraudulently billing her donors for leadership training. She spoke abstractly about moral values, but after enduring 90 grueling minutes of cold, unforgiving, quantifiable numbers, her reliance on vague values sounded exactly like what it was, the desperate, empty filler a politician deploys when they are utterly incapable of addressing the glaring reality they are actively failing to manage. Trump sat entirely motionless, his posture completely loose and remarkably unbothered, radiating the tranquil satisfaction of an apex predator who knows the hunt is definitively over and is perfectly content to let the devastating silence accomplish the remaining butchery. He did not gloat, he did not offer a mocking coda, and he deliberately chose not to fire one final gratuitous shot into the wreckage. Coming from Donald Trump, a man who has virtually never in his 70-plus years left a rhetorical bullet unfired, this jarring, unnatural restraint was its own terrifying form of psychological dominance, signaling that the evening had organically provided more than enough destruction without requiring his further assistance. Back in the chaotic shadows of the wings, Ocasio-Cortez's senior communications director stared blankly at the glowing screen of his smartphone, where the pre-drafted aggressive press release boasting that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez courageously confronted the president on his privileged, out-of-touch upbringing sat fully typed, reading like a useless, expired boarding pass for a transatlantic flight that had departed 3 hours ago. The brutal reality of the last hour was that the debate had not been an indictment of Trump's wealthy upbringing. It had become a catastrophic, televised autopsy of her own, an unsparing dissection of her abandoned district, the vital statistics she failed to memorize, the dark money she could not legally explain, the disastrous Munich transcript she could never unsay, and the damning silly girl moniker she could never unpost from the internet. The heavily spun pre-drafted statement addressed absolutely none of these fatal wounds, forcing the shell-shocked communications director to slowly highlight the entire document, hit the delete key, and stare in paralyzed silence at the blinking cursor of a blank white screen. Outside the convention center walls, the night air of Flushing smelled exactly as it always had, a heavy, intoxicating blend of roasted garlic, diesel exhaust fumes, and the distinct sugary sweetness radiating from the vibrant biomarkets on Roosevelt Avenue that stubbornly refused to ever close their metal shutters. The massive Q7 municipal bus rumbled past the arena, half empty and bathed in sickly yellow light, steadily grinding its way toward the working-class enclave of Corona, where in exactly 6 hours, Gloria Reyes would drag herself out of bed in the freezing darkness to begin aggressively, violently kneading the morning dough. The immediate fallout from the debate was catastrophic, generating a blast radius that instantly reshaped the national political landscape as the three distinct viral moments detonated across the internet, each leaving behind a uniquely devastating crater. The first clip, the initial exchange regarding the wrought iron fence, AOC's rehearsed insult, Trump's spontaneous booming laugh, and his brutal pivot comparing the kid who built to the kid who posted, racked up an unfathomable 41 million views in less than 72 hours. The terrifying efficacy of the clip rested entirely on the authenticity of Trump's unbothered laughter. The physical, shoulder-shaking amusement effortlessly neutralized her carefully crafted, focus-grouped insult before it could even begin to take root in the public consciousness, proving the golden rule of political warfare. Attacks are specifically designed to produce a defensive flinch, but genuine laughter forces the audience to instantly recalibrate their perception of power. The millions watching from their phones saw a fiercely confident progressive throw her absolute best knockout punch, only to watch the towering billionaire laugh it off with ease, a dynamic that instantly shrunk the magnitude of the attack and severely diminished the political stature of the woman throwing it. The fact that the progressive seating section visibly transitioned from roaring triumph to nervous uncertainty in exactly 8 seconds became a masterclass in optics. 8 seconds is the fatal half-life of a viral political strike when the intended target simply refuses to bleed. The second clip, universally branded as the crime rate double, featured the agonizing footage of Trump demanding the exact same statistical answer 40 minutes apart, with Ocasio-Cortez visibly freezing and failing to produce a number both times, amassing 33 million views across bipartisan platforms. This specific footage wasn't being circulated as a right-wing political smear. It was being weaponized as a devastating, universally understood competence test, generating the organic, party-agnostic disgust of millions of working-class citizens watching a politician who earns a taxpayer-funded salary of $174,000 a year openly demonstrate a total, unapologetic ignorance of the fundamental survival statistics terrorizing her own backyard. When a prominent, highly respected member of the Queen's Community Board quote-tweeted the video with a simple 3-word caption reading, "She doesn't know." The post organically accumulated 1.2 million likes, cementing the narrative that her progressive crown had entirely slipped. But it was the third clip, the quiet, uncharacteristically somber moment where Trump simply told her to go home, that achieved true immortality, continuing to circulate wildly a full month later when the aggressive attack ads had long faded from memory. It resonated with terrifying longevity because it wasn't a standard bombastic political attack. It was genuine paternal advice delivered from the person the public least expected, spoken in a hushed, authentic Queen's accent that no one had ever heard him utilize, addressing a shared hometown that both of them fundamentally understood. That rare, unvarnished glimpse of reality from a man famous for endless theatricality forced viewers to hit replay again and again just to verify they hadn't hallucinated the tone, permanently searing the image of the disconnected, out-of-touch Congresswoman into the minds of her own constituents. The political bleeding for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has officially become a hemorrhage. While her battered communications team desperately deployed a sanitized press release that completely ignored the crippling 70% crime spike and her catastrophic Munich debate debacle, their glaring omissions served only as a tacit admission of political guilt. The institutional fallout was immediate and lethal. The FEC quietly confirmed active reviews into her campaign's dark money operations, while elite Democratic donors began weaponizing her silly girl gaffe to permanently assassinate her 2028 presidential ambitions. But the true existential threat isn't brewing in the velvet-lined rooms of Washington. It's rising from the damp church basements of Corona, Queens. Fierce primary challenger Elena Vargas has already begun capitalizing on AOC's televised amnesia, rallying exhausted voters by effortlessly reciting the exact local survival metrics, crime rates, rent hikes, and the price of groceries. that the Congresswoman spectacularly failed to produce on a national stage. Even historically loyal constituents like Gloria Reyes, a local baker, waking at 4:00 a.m. to face crushing inflation and a freezing storefront, find themselves quietly agreeing with Donald Trump's devastating debate stage command. Their representative needs to come home. As the working class streets of her own district begin to actively rebel against their globe-trotting progressive icon, the stage is rapidly set for a brutal political reckoning. Has the most famous congresswoman in America irreversibly lost the pulse of her own people? And what devastating strike will her rivals launch next as her political empire finally begins to fracture?